Angela Carter had a relatively short career as a poet, as a young woman. When she was a student, she went to Bristol as a mature student when she was 22, and she wrote poetry, most of it between 1963 and 1966. There was a little bit more in the 70s, but then it seems to have just petered out. And I think that she found once she was writing novels and stories and plays indeed, she had more room to stretch her imaginative legs perhaps, and that was the medium that suited her. I think one of the things that she discovered early, then perhaps forgot or moved away from and returned to, was that she was someone who was very good at working with an existing story, with an existing cast of characters. She always liked to have a very clear, she said that when she heard writers say that sometimes they didn't know what their characters were going to do, she thought that was very slack. You know, you should know what your characters are for, how they are going to work out an argument. And I think that she found in medieval literature two very useful things for her. One was this pre-existing tale, which could be rearranged, reconfigured. And the other was it was a kind of safe place in the early 60s if you were doing English literature, because the great tradition of Leavis, which she always called the eat up your broccoli approach, was very dominant. But they didn't really go into the medieval or indeed the kind of antiquarian writing of Thomas Browne, which obviously interested her and which was barely regarded as literature then. So she had this kind of safe space. It was one of the things she said later she admired about Walter Delamere, that he, in his case, by putting in elements of allegory, he kind of kept the critics at bay. It was a kind of no-go zone. And I think it was a very good place for her to kind of begin to try her strength as a writer. The first poem in the book and the longest is Unicorn, which appeared in Vision, one of those small literary magazines that came and went in the blink of an eye, but was then reissued in a kind of Ronioed, stapled up form. After that, it's quite interesting where she published, because she published in the London magazine, she published in the Aylesford Review, a handful of poems which are remarkably interesting in themselves, because I think they show a slightly softer edge than a lot of her work at that time, and also because the Aylesford Review was part of an extraordinary moment. It could only have happened in England. A lot of Angela Carter's influences were French, but only in England would you get this combination of a friary, a lot of European exiles, ceramics, radical politics, and a literary magazine. She gave herself to, perhaps they were exercises, in reworking, I think it would be wrong to say translating, except in the freest sense, passages that obviously she'd studied reading medieval literature. One from Piers Plowman is a very famous passage, which she makes very lyrical and at the same time slightly more unpleasant than Langland makes it, because she brings out the implication that the peacock breaks its eggs in order to go on having sex. That's latent in Langland, not in Carter. She brings it right out. And the treatise of the three women, the two wives and the widow, by Dunbar, it's a very, very long poem. Her version of it is shorter. In some ways, of course, it's more shouty because she's writing in England in the 1960s. But it's also slightly more decorous. She doesn't actually come out with the sort of fusillade of bad language that Dunbar allows himself. What she does do, of course, by reworking his poem, which is about a man unseen watching women, she is now a woman impersonating a man who is a voyeur on a group of women. And that adds an extraordinarily interesting extra level of texture and perspective, I think. In selecting the poems, I decided that I wasn't going to include any that survived in manuscript that hadn't been published, because they were works that she obviously felt were not complete, and I think that is the province of the biographer. When it came to the published work, it just so happened that in order to see what she'd written in the Aylesford Review, I bought a copy online, which didn't cost very much. And when it arrived, it was hers. It had her bookplate in the front. And she had made these corrections, and they're very clear corrections. So I thought, well, I think, my job now is to put those in, because it was a retrospective correction to something that had already been published. And I think they're interesting because actually once or twice she's correcting the metre. She has a very good ear for metre. Again, rather an old-fashioned thing in some ways, one might think, for the kind of poet that she was. So I felt very comfortable about including that.